Late November 2025. From the barren peaks of the Atacama Desert in Chile to the summit of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, a fleet of telescopes locked their gaze on a single speck of light, a strange stream of ice and dust, known as 3IATLAS. At first glance, it seemed no more than a solitary traveler, a distant shard of the cosmos passing through the solar system on a journey that spanned tens of thousands of years. But the numbers whispered a different story. Orbital graphs trembled like erratic heartbeats. Minor deviations, seemingly harmless, began to surface. The gap between it and Mars was narrowing, not close enough to annihilate, but near enough to force astronomers to lower their voices, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile silence of this interstellar visitor. What chilled them was not the orbit itself, but Atlas's unpredictable temperament. Ordinary comets follow their rituals. As they approach the Sun, surface ice gradually sublimates. The dust tail glows in a graceful arc, and their behavior can be forecast with reasonable certainty. Atlas, however, behaved like a rebel. Massive outbursts of CO2 erupted early, violently, swelling far beyond every recorded precedent. Each flash of light was not a romantic shimmer across the night, but a brutal convulsion, flaring and then collapsing without warning. Reports recorded it in sterile language: outburst event, anomalous optical variation, unstable coma. Yet behind those clinical terms lurked a primal fear. If one object could so openly defy rules once thought immutable, how many other laws stood waiting to be shattered? The media quickly magnified the atmosphere of unease. Major newspapers rolled out headlines: "The Interstellar Time Bomb," "The Universe's Fatal Gamble." News channels looped endless simulations. In one scenario, Atlas grazed safely past Mars. In another, fragments slammed into the red planet with the force of thousands of nuclear warheads. The public had no idea what to believe, but anxiety spread like a live wire. Financial markets wavered, space agencies issued steady streams of reassurance, and social media erupted with theories. Atlas might be an alien probe, or perhaps a divine omen of Judgment Day. What planted the deepest fear, however, was the gap between knowledge and darkness. As Earth, Mars, and the Sun prepared to line up, Atlas would slip into an observation blackout for weeks. Humanity would lose the ability to track it precisely, right at the moment of greatest risk. Astronomers described it as playing a chess match while the board was hidden from sight. You knew the pieces were still moving, but you could not see the moves being made. In that silence, every missing data point felt like a skipped heartbeat, every unanswered question like a slow-burning fuse. Atlas, once a distant celestial body, had become a matter of life and death, a riddle whose prize might be fleeting peace or a brutal warning about the fragility of planetary safety. Late December 2025, Atlas had vanished from direct sight, swallowed by the harsh alignment of Earth, Mars, and the Sunday. The telescopes that once traced its every erratic breath now displayed only flat, lifeless graphs, like a heartbeat that had stopped. In that emptiness, a different silence arose, not the silence of space, but the silence of human helplessness. The scientific community continued to issue routine reports, but they felt like letters dropped into an empty mailbox, with no one there to receive them. And it was this absence of data that fanned the flames of collective imagination. What was happening out there, behind the blinding wall of the Sun? Inside control rooms, the atmosphere grew as heavy as an interrupted surgery. Engineers checked and rechecked every parameter, as if a single misplaced dot on a screen could turn into a forecast of apocalypse. If Atlas were to fragment right now, we wouldn't even see it, one expert muttered, and the room fell into silence. They all knew that at a distance of just a few tens of millions of kilometers, even a stray fragment could become a colossal bullet, a threat not only to Mars but to the entire orbital architecture of the solar system. The public, cut off from genuine data, filled the void with self-made scenarios. Television channels broadcast nightly specials, rendering Atlas as a massive ice giant, rotating slowly, poised to scatter countless shards. Social media split into two stark camps. One saw Atlas as a dark omen, proof of humanity's smallness and fragility. The other treated it as a chance to witness cosmic truth, perhaps extraterrestrial life, perhaps a brutal trial for civilization itself. Arguments flared, growing more extreme by the day, mirroring the tension of a violin string stretched to its breaking point. The anxiety seeped into realms far beyond astronomy.
orbit.
Financial markets
Hold on
wavered,
the
and
occlusion.
aerospace technology companies saw their stocks lurch unpredictably. Politicians, long accustomed to debates over budgets and policies, now faced questions of a metaphysical weight. If Atlas truly poses a threat, are we prepared? And if not, who bears the blame? Questions no one wanted to answer, yet none could evade. Meanwhile, robotic observatories orbiting Mars, originally built to monitor atmospheric dust and environmental data, suddenly became the only eyes capable of glimpsing Atlas up close. But were they strong enough to transmit clear signals when solar storms and particle waves could erupt without warning? NASA and ESA maintained a chilling silence about their contingency measures, only deepening public suspicion. Each passing hour without new information felt like another stone laid upon the chest, pressing the world into an unbearable weight. Atlas, in its absence, became more present than ever. It no longer needed to hang in the sky to sow fear. Its very concealment made humanity feel as though awaiting a verdict not yet pronounced. Scientists understood the truth well. The silence of the universe has never meant safety. And now, at the close of 2025, that silence felt like the ticking of an interstellar time bomb, counting down in the cold and endless dark. New Year's Eve, 2025. As cities across Earth lit up with fireworks to welcome the coming year, an invisible shadow lingered in the sky. 3IATLAS. Still hidden behind the sun's glare, everyone knew. Somewhere out in that vast darkness, the interstellar visitor continued its passage, carrying uncertainty like a sealed verdict waiting to be read. Inside the control room of an observatory, a massive screen displayed webs of projected trajectories stretching like a spider's snare. Each line was a possibility: Atlas gliding safely past, Atlas shattering into fragments, or worse, those fragments pulled by Mars's gravity and flung chaotically throughout the inner system. One specialist whispered, "If it explodes, the consequences could last for centuries." No one answered. They all knew his words were no longer a distant hypothesis, but a vision heavy enough to drown out the cheers of celebration echoing outside. Out there, the public's curiosity had shifted into something darker. People began dreaming strange dreams. Mars buried in oceans of red dust, Earth quaking under meteor storms, mysterious lights streaking across the heavens. Psychologists warned of a phenomenon they called collective suggestion, when humanity imagines the worst-case scenario and then behaves as though it is inevitable. But few cared for scientific explanations. What mattered was that Atlas's silence gnawed like a toothache. The less it was seen, the more it haunted. Curiosity turned into a ravenous hunger. People scoured every leak, every grainy satellite photo from Mars's orbit. A single blurry image, a faint halo of light, was enough to ignite online forums with thousands of comments. Some insisted it was proof that Atlas was disintegrating. Others claimed it was artificial light signals from an alien intelligence. These theories spread faster than any official bulletin, because the public craved something solid in an ocean of ambiguity. Within the scientific community, the real fear was no longer whether Atlas would strike Mars, but what they could not know. The absence of data had become an invisible storm sweeping through every prediction model. Each time an alert system flashed, each time computers produced conflicting outcomes, their hearts tightened. Atlas was likened to a time bomb with its countdown clock hidden. It might have months left or only days. By then, Atlas had transcended the boundaries of pure science. It had become a symbol of fragility, the fragility of knowledge, the fragility of humanity's faith in its ability to govern the cosmos. And as 2025 drew to a close, people realized the true disaster lay not only in the chance of impact, but in the haunting truth that humanity was stepping into a new year under the weight of a question no one could answer. Was Atlas a harmless traveler or a messenger of planetary doom? January 2026. Atlas moved into its closest approach to Mars, and every prediction suddenly felt as fragile as sheets of paper scattered by the wind. The final images captured by robotic telescopes in orbit showed its glowing halo breaking apart, flinging out vague ribbons of debris that looked like a hive of giant bees torn open in the frozen void. Scientists had long insisted that the chance of a direct collision was virtually zero, that tens of millions of kilometers were enough to keep the red planet safe. But those two words, virtually zero, turned into a blade slicing through thought. For if even a single fragment, just a few hundred meters wide, were tugged off course by Mars's gravity, it would strike at tens of kilometers per second. The impact would equal the detonation of thousands of nuclear warheads, transforming an entire swath of land into an unstoppable ocean of fire. Try to imagine it. Across Mars's sky, a blinding white streak ignites, followed by the ground convulsing, as though a colossal fist from the cosmos had punched straight through. The instantaneous heat would melt subsurface ice, spewing plumes of steam and toxic gas. Shattered rock would be flung upward, glowing red fragments suspended before crashing back down in a relentless meteor storm. Within hours, the planet would drown in artificial night, a thick crimson shroud of dust blotting out every trace of sunlight. Surface temperatures would plummet in an instant, turning Mars's already thin atmosphere into a cold, suffocating cage. Satellites in orbit, once the pride of human engineering, would be swept by the storm of debris. Some would flare up and explode, bursting like funereal fireworks in space. Others would fall silent forever, leaving only broken signals across the screens. On Earth, mission control centers would see only scattered fragments of data before their monitors went black. In that moment, humanity was stripped of its eyes. The most sophisticated instruments, projects worth billions of dollars, became useless ghosts adrift in the void. But that would only be the beginning. The surge of dust, gas, and molten rock from the impact would not remain confined to the crater it carved. It would expand outward, billowing like a sea of burning ash, sweeping across the already barren terrain. Unlike Earth, with its thick, protective atmosphere, Mars was nearly naked before the blow. Every ounce of energy would strike directly unfiltered, unshielded. A single collision would force the planet to absorb the raw, unrelenting power of the universe. A power fierce enough to melt geological memories that had slumbered for billions of years. If anyone had been present on Mars at that instant, they would have witnessed nothing but a flash of blinding white, then absolute darkness cascading down. No time left to breathe, no chance left to pray, only the sensation of being swallowed by an apocalypse with no escape. And on Earth, billions of people, though separated by hundreds of millions of kilometers, would shudder at the vision. A world once promised as humanity's second home, reduced instead to a silent battlefield of the cosmos. As the first plumes of dust erupted from the impact crater, Mars instantly turned into a planetary nightmare. The sky, once perpetually tinted in red, was now drowned in a heavy blackness, so thick it erased the Sunday. Scientists labeled the phenomenon with a cold phrase, nuclear winter effect. In truth, it was more like a slow death blanketing the entire world. Temperatures plunged by dozens of degrees within days. Icy winds lashed across an already barren surface, transforming it into a frozen wasteland. No shaft of light lasted long enough to nurture life or even sustain machinery. The whole planet sank into shadow. In those first days, the surviving satellites strained to transmit their final images. They revealed only blurred glimmers through the haze, perhaps glowing boulders falling from the sky, perhaps colossal bolts of lightning flaring as charged dust collided within the atmosphere. Soon, one by one, the satellites fell silent. Some circuits were fried by electromagnetic surges, others were struck by debris, still others were simply buried in the inescapable storm of particles. Humanity's eyes around Mars dimmed like candles snuffed by wind. On Earth, control centers received nothing but silence punctuated by stray, meaningless signals. A wave of helplessness swept across. Humanity had not only lost its data, but its very capacity to witness history unfolding. The rovers on the surface, Curiosity, Perseverance, and their automated outposts had been engineered to endure ordinary dust storms, but they were utterly powerless against this cataclysm. With the sky fully veiled in dust, solar panels turned useless, and energy reserves dwindled. Circuits twitched, froze, and then went dark under the brutal cold. No more scientific readings, no more images, only a heavy silence, like an invisible cemetery. Earth looked on and realized decades of accumulated intellect and engineering had been erased in mere days. But the greatest shock lay not only in the silence, but in the scale of the disaster. Computer models suggested the dust layer would linger in the Martian atmosphere for months, perhaps years. That meant any dream of colonization within this century had dissolved into futility. Mars had been transformed into a frozen prison, where every ray of light was strangled and every source of energy cut off. A planet once hailed as humanity's second doorway had instead become a collective tomb, not because lives were lost there, but because hope itself had been buried. On Earth, as news broadcasts delivered the first analyses, crowds sat motionless before their screens. There were no cheers, no arguments, only shock, only stunned silence, as they witnessed a world millions of years old transformed in the blink of an eye. There was no blood, no screaming, and yet the sense of apocalypse felt sharper than any movie, because this time, it was not imagination. This was reality, a reality that forced humanity to confront its own helpless smallness in the face of the cosmos. In the weeks that followed, Mars all but vanished from humanity's sky, not because it had gone anywhere, but because it was swallowed by a colossal shroud of dust, so opaque that even the most powerful telescopes could register only a faint, blurred halo. Scientific bulletins named it a global obscuration event, but in truth, it was an admission that humanity had lost the ability to see. Mars was no longer the familiar red planet, it had become only a shadow, a world drowned in the depths of chaos. On Earth, human reactions shifted in stages. At first came panic, as the media painted visions of impact craters dozens of kilometers wide, dust blanketing the entire planet, and Mars's sky smothered in darkness. But soon, panic gave way to something more terrifying: paralysis. People no longer argued, churned out theories at fever pitch. They sat still, staring at black screens, feeling a profound helplessness. For the first time, humanity confronted not just a distant catastrophe, but the sobering reality that centuries of knowledge, technology, and effort could be erased by a single flick of the universe's tail. Emergency councils of the United Nations, NASA, ESA, and JAXA were convened again and again, but most of it amounted to circular words. No technology could salvage a disaster already in motion. No spacecraft could intercept fragments the size of mountains. No weapon could dissolve a dust storm that covered an entire planet. All planetary defense systems, the very plans once hailed as the shield of the future, proved meaningless. Against Atlas, humanity stood like fragile creatures before a rising tide, trembling as the waves advanced. In the collective mind, an apocalyptic fear spread. No one thought of Mars as a frontier anymore, as a place to colonize or build a second home. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting human frailty. Seeing its fate, billions on Earth were forced to ask, if Mars could be undone in just hours, was Earth truly any different? The silence of the cosmos grew heavier, like a suspended verdict hanging over all of humankind. Philosophers and writers described the event as the day hope was buried alive. No corpses, no explosions shook Earth, and yet it was a cosmic funeral. A funeral for the dream of settlement, a funeral for the belief that humanity could master its own destiny, a funeral for the idea that science would always deliver answers. The raw truth stood exposed. There are questions the universe answers only with destruction. As January 2026 closed, the echoes of the impact still lingered. Not as sound, but as absolute silence. The silence of dead satellites, of rovers lying motionless, of a planet swallowed whole by shadow. On Earth, that silence became a collective nightmare. The vision that one day, that same darkness might not just fall upon Mars, but descend upon our small blue home. And when that day came, there would be nowhere left to run. February 2026. Mars was still buried beneath the thick veil of red dust from its collision with the Atlas fragment. But within that darkness, a new phenomenon erupted, one that left both the scientific community and the public on Earth stunned. The entire Martian sky suddenly lit up, not with sunlight, but with colossal auroral bands stretching from pole to pole. In the past, auroras on Mars had been faint, sporadic streaks, barely visible to the naked eye. Now they had transformed into a vast, chaotic curtain, flooding the heavens with green, violet, and crimson, writhing madly across the blackness, as though the red planet had become a cosmic mirror, reflecting the rage of space itself. Observatories described it with the phrase, planet-wide superaurora, but those who watched live could only mutter that it looked like the light of Doomsday. What fueled the growing unease was not simply that auroras had appeared, it was how they burst forth, without any discernible cycle, untethered from the usual solar wind patterns, flaring and collapsing violently, like seizures impossible to predict. One European satellite recorded the Martian electromagnetic field swinging so wildly that its sensors burned out, leaving behind only strings of corrupted data. Meanwhile, NASA's instruments reported repeated radio blackouts as sudden electromagnetic whirlwinds swept through the ionosphere. For minutes at a time, the entire planet seemed to turn into a colossal flickering bulb, radiating invisible waves strong enough to fry any system caught within reach. On Earth, in the control rooms, the air grew heavy as lead. No one dared to assert with certainty that this was purely natural. Some scientists argued it was merely the after-effect of the massive charged dust cloud left behind by Atlas as it passed through Mars's orbit. But others stayed silent, then broke it with questions once relegated to fiction. What if this isn't a physical phenomenon at all? What if this is a signal? The words cut into the confidence of science like a blade. For although few wished to admit it, the spectacle over Mars carried a symmetry, a deliberateness, too precise to resemble the randomness of nature. As live images streamed back to Earth and filled giant screens, millions across the world sat in silence. They could not tell if they were witnessing a brutal physical process or a form of communication humanity lacked the language to decode. Our way turned to unease. Journalists dubbed it the Wall of Judgment Light. Tabloids proclaimed it the greeting of an alien civilization. On social media, theories multiplied at dizzying speed. Perhaps Atlas was never just a celestial body, but an artificial construct disguised as one. In the sea of chaotic information, only one thing was certain. Humanity was shaken to its core, and for the first time, no one felt sure that science could explain everything. Just days after the planet-wide auroras appeared, Mars was struck by yet another unprecedented phenomenon: electromagnetic cyclones. Monitoring instruments captured vast spirals rising tens of kilometers high, twisting upward from the dusty surface into the thin atmosphere. But unlike ordinary storms of sand and grit, these vortices blazed with violent light, as if the entire columns had been charged. With each eruption, millions of charged particles shot outward, forming colossal cosmic lightning bolts bright enough to outshine the moon when viewed from Earth. Scientists described them as the universe's giant free generators, yet behind that sterile phrasing was a trembling admission. They had no idea how such monstrous energy could be sustained. Atmospheric theory was insufficient, and plasma physics models were inadequate. Some experts were forced to confess on camera: Atlas has sown into Mars a chaos we have never confronted. The words spread instantly, seeding deeper unease among the public. The remaining orbital stations reported constant interference. Radio frequencies were blocked by the electromagnetic spirals, making communication between Mars and Earth intermittent, flaring with bursts of data, only to vanish into silence as if nothing had ever been sent. Each blackout left Earth's control centers in tense silence. The dread lay not only in the loss of information, but in the growing inability to distinguish what belonged to nature and what lay beyond it. At times, the blazing columns twisted into perfect spirals, shapes so striking they resembled ancient symbols carved into stone. Many who saw them felt a chill. Was this mere coincidence or a message etched directly into the sky? The public on Earth was swept into an emotional storm. They were awed by the spectacle, yet unnerved by the sensation of being watched in return. Live broadcasts of the electromagnetic cyclones turned the Martian sky into a haunted stage of light, keeping millions awake at night. Online forums overflowed with questions. If Mars glows like this, is Earth still safe? If Atlas can make a planet flicker like a bulb, what stops it from doing the same to us? Questions without answers, yet whispered by everyone. Amid this climate, governments began to fear a domino effect. Atmospheric researchers warned that the turbulent electromagnetic fields around Mars might extend toward Earth as plasma waves, disrupting satellites, GPS navigation, and even shorting out entire power grids. Unease no longer lingered on a distant planet. It had bled into everyday life. A powerful enough geomagnetic storm could plunge the world into darkness within minutes, and the image of Mars glowing like a flickering lamp became a brutal reminder of the fragility of modern civilization. March 2026. The planet-wide auroras and electromagnetic cyclones on Mars had barely begun to fade when yet another phenomenon emerged, pushing unease to its peak. Observatories on Earth began detecting strange radio emissions coming from the turbulent region around Mars. At first, they were nothing more than scattered bursts of static, like rain falling on radio waves. But soon, analysts noticed an uncanny coincidence. The bursts repeated in steady cycles, almost like a rhythm. Some experts tried to dismiss them as natural plasma oscillations, but the perfection of the repetition left many speechless. In laboratories, strings of numbers were printed in columns. Some scientists noticed they formed basic geometric patterns: triangles, spirals, and parallel lines. When these images were displayed on screens, the reaction was electric. Some burst into tears, others trembled and whispered that it was the language of the cosmos. But others grew angry, insisting that humans were projecting meaning onto chaos. Whichever side they took, no one could deny that unease had spread throughout the scientific community. The public, meanwhile, was swept into polarization. One side believed the signals to be evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, that Atlas was not merely a block of ice and dust, but something controlled, a messenger crossing the stars. The other insisted it was an omen, the universe's way of reminding humanity of its smallness and arrogance. Media outlets wasted no time amplifying the fear. Headlines screamed, "Is Atlas talking to us? The code of Doomsday? Or just nature's cruel joke?" Each headline thickened the air with dread. On social media, millions shared recordings of the signals, slowed down to hear the strange heartbeat within. Some claimed to hear echoes like the pulse of a living being. Others swore they heard whispered voices, though no one had proof. The phenomenon spread worldwide, becoming a collective obsession. Few still cared what Atlas was physically doing to Mars. All attention was consumed by a single question: what or who was sending messages through those electromagnetic storms? Governments worried the psychological unrest might spill into social chaos. Yet despite official reassurances, the stark truth remained. Humanity could not tell where natural phenomena ended and intentional signals began. The vision of Mars glowing like a haunted lantern, coupled with the repeated rhythms in the static, turned a distant planet into a mirror of humanity's oldest fear. The fear of the unknown, of an invisible gaze fixed upon us. As March came to a close, the scientific community still had no unified answer. But for the public, the answer had already crystallized. Atlas was no longer a silent guest. It had become a luminous enigma, one that pulsed, one that echoed, one that instilled in humanity the most terrifying feeling of all. Confusion so deep, no one knew what to believe anymore. April 2026. As the dazzling auroras and electromagnetic cyclones on Mars gradually subsided, a new fear began to surface, one that did not explode in blinding flashes, but seeped like a lingering fever: the threat of biological contamination from Atlas. The spectroscopic data collected by telescopes no longer appeared as dry curves alone. They revealed unusual absorption bands, hinting at the presence of complex organic compounds, chains of carbon, hydrogen, even amino groups, the very building blocks of life. The discovery immediately split the scientific community in two. One side rejoiced. If Atlas carried organic molecules, it could serve as living evidence for panspermia. The hypothesis that life on Earth and across other planets may have been seeded by interstellar visitors. But the other side responded with suffocating dread. If Atlas had introduced compounds or microorganisms never before encountered, then Mars, the planet long chosen as a natural laboratory to search for traces of native life, might already have been contaminated beyond repair. This anxiety was not only scientific but ethical. For decades, Mars exploration missions had been designed under strict protocols to avoid carrying Earth's microbes across, keeping the red planet as pristine as possible. Yet all that caution now seemed meaningless, as a massive interstellar body, like Atlas, may have already blanketed its surface and atmosphere with a layer of alien organics. If tomorrow a rover drilled into the Martian soil and discovered organic molecules, could we be certain they belonged to Mars, or would they merely be Atlas's foreign signature imprinted on the planet? That question echoed through every international conference, like a silent indictment. Humanity had acted too late to protect the primordial integrity of another world. Now we risked losing forever the chance to distinguish native life from alien contamination. Editorials repeatedly invoked the term planetary ethics. Some scholars argued, if Atlas had indeed seeded life onto Mars, then sending more spacecraft or even settlers in the future would be no different from destroying a grand experiment the universe itself had carefully staged. Conversely, other voices warned, if Atlas carried pathogens, then we bore the responsibility of preventing them from spreading, even if it meant intervening with sterilization technologies to cleanse the planet's surface. Amid the debate, what remained was helplessness. A single foreign organic molecule mingling with a sample could cast doubt over decades of research. Everything we thought we knew about Mars could unravel into meaninglessness. The dream of discovering extraterrestrial life had warped into a nightmare, an investigation where the crime scene had already been wiped clean by the hand of an interstellar traveler. And within that anxiety rose a chilling reminder. Sometimes the greatest threat is not immediate destruction, but the permanent blurring of truth. In that heavy atmosphere, the scientific community began proposing two opposing scenarios for Atlas, both dire enough to plant seeds of anxiety that could last decades. The first scenario, Atlas as the sower of life. It may have carried organic molecules, even ancient microorganisms encased in ice, traveling across millions of light years to scatter onto Mars. If true, humanity would be witnessing an ontological moment. Life may not be exclusive to Earth, but a widespread phenomenon, mobile and nomadic, carried across the stars by cosmic travelers. Such a discovery could rewrite the entirety of human philosophy. Yet this scenario was not pure joy for life. Seeded by Atlas would render all efforts to search for Mars's native life meaningless. We would never know which voice truly belonged to the planet, and which was merely an echo from an interstellar visitor. The second scenario was far darker. Atlas as the sower of disease. The organic compounds it carried might act as toxins against any potential Martian biosphere, or worse, against future exploration equipment. A single alien microbe capable of replication under extreme conditions could erase every trace of native life just beginning to form. For Earth, the danger loomed larger still. If one day, spacecraft returned with samples from Mars, might we unwittingly bring back a doomsday seed from a realm beyond our control? Both scenarios, though opposite, forced humanity into grappling with a profound ethical dilemma. Do we still have the right to intervene on a planet already altered by Atlas? If native life ever existed, its signature may now be blurred. If new life has been seeded, it does not belong to Mars but to some distant world. And if only toxins remain, then every dream of settlement was extinguished before it even began. At international conferences, debates turned heated. One camp stressed moral responsibility. Halt all plans of colonization, preserve Mars as a cosmic sanctuary, at least until the true impact of Atlas is known. The opposing camp warned that if Atlas had already seeded the planet, delay would only cause humanity to lose the chance to study and control it. If we don't go, one scientist declared, we may never know what Atlas has brought. But that very question sparked deeper unease. Is knowledge always better than ignorance, if the truth means opening a door that can never be shut again? Among the public, the debates only deepened the unease. People no longer saw Mars as a barren red wilderness, but as an invisible laboratory where a colossal experiment was unfolding beyond human reach. The thought sent shivers down spines. If Atlas could seed Mars, might it also seed Earth? Should its dust one day drift into our atmosphere? No one dared to say it was impossible. And it was precisely this void of certainty that became fertile ground for dread to grow, heavier with each passing day. May 2026. As debates raged on, one truth became increasingly clear. Humanity was confronting the limits of both knowledge and responsibility. Atlas was no longer just a distant celestial body. It had become a test of cosmic ethics. The question was no longer whether Atlas carried life, but rather, how would we choose to respond to that possibility? Biologists warned that any hasty action, such as sending more spacecraft to drill into soil now blanketed by Atlas's dust, could destroy the only chance of distinguishing native life from alien contamination. In official documents, the term back contamination appeared again and again. If samples from Mars were brought home, Atlas's dust could slip into Earth's laboratories. A single breach would be enough to spark disaster. An unfamiliar organic compound could react unpredictably with our biosphere, triggering a chain effect beyond control. This fear was not mere speculation, but a looming presence, spelled out in every report delivered to the United Nations. Yet within this anxiety, humanity was forced to turn the mirror upon itself. Had we been too hasty in our drive to conquer the cosmos? When discussing panspermia, many scholars emphasize that life might be a diffuse phenomenon, not the possession of any single planet. If so, our duty was not to claim, but to preserve. Could we summon the humility to regard Mars after Atlas as a cosmic heritage site to be safeguarded, rather than a territory waiting to be exploited? Among the public, fear spread into collective unease. Some viewed Atlas as the bringer of life, a sign that humanity was not alone, but many others saw it as the sower of shadows, a reminder that life carries not only hope, but peril. Public discourse revolved around a single, haunting question. Should humanity still set foot on Mars, or withdraw and observe from afar? The question itself exposed a deep helplessness, for both choices carried their own risks. Ultimately, Atlas forced humanity to face a harsh truth. Sometimes the enemy is not swift death by impact, but the blurring of truth. If Atlas had left behind life, we could never be sure where it came from. If it had seeded a disease, we might not respond in time. If it carried nothing at all, the confusion it sowed would still be enough to haunt generations. In all these possibilities, one certainty remained. Atlas had forever altered how humanity regarded the Red Planet, and more broadly, its own role and responsibility in the universe. May ended with a question still unanswered. Amid the prolonged silence of Mars, humanity realized that the price of knowledge is sometimes loss. Loss of faith in the purity of a world, loss of the feeling of safety, and loss of the boundary between science and philosophy. Atlas had sown more than dust and compounds into our imagination. It had planted another seed, the seed of anxiety, ensuring that every generation to come would have to ask, how far should we go, and are we truly prepared to bear the consequences of crossing that threshold? June 2026. While debates over Atlas's potential biological contamination still raged, another fear suddenly descended, this time not in laboratories, but in the skies above Mars. The latest orbital measurements revealed that both of the red planet's tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos, had begun to wobble in strange, unnatural ways. At first, the discrepancies measured only millimeters, but with each passing day, they grew into unmistakable deviations. Scientists were stunned to realize that Atlas's gravitational pull, though it had merely brushed past, had sown a seed of lethal chaos into their orbits. Phobos, the innermost moon, appeared in the data like a creature on its deathbed. Cracks across its surface, once documented as minor fractures, were now widening rapidly, like fissures in glass struck too hard. Operational satellites still watching reported that Phobos trembled rhythmically, as though it were a heart beating erratically before stopping altogether. Deimos, though smaller and farther away, was not spared. Its orbit had begun to lurch into a distorted ellipse, as if caught in an invisible dance of death, unable to resist its pull. Astrophysicists named the phenomenon chaotic resonance. Atlas, by mass and gravity alone, had shaken the very foundations of these fragile moons' orbits. The terrifying truth was that the chaos would not stop. Simulations showed that Phobos might shatter within decades, unleashing a storm of fragments that would rain down on Mars or else disperse into a vast ring of dust and rock encircling the planet. Deimos, by contrast, faced the risk of being flung from Mars's embrace altogether, drifting into the cold void like an abandoned ghost ship. Both outcomes carried the weight of a death sentence for the moons, and with them, irreversible change for the entire Martian system. Computer-generated imagery replayed on television screens. Phobos exploding, billions of tons of rock stretching into a pale ring around the red planet. Mars's sky already haunted by dust and auroras now ablaze with floating debris, a funeral wreath suspended for eternity. The vision left audiences on Earth shaken. Few still dared to dream of Mars as a second home. In their eyes, it had become a cosmic prison, a world whose heavens blazed perpetually with the death of the very satellites that once sheltered it. In scientific conferences, silence lasted longer than arguments. No one wished to admit that Atlas's mere passing had been enough to rewrite the destiny of an entire orbital system. A chilling thought spread. If a single gravitational nudge could cast Mars into such disorder, what would prevent Atlas from doing the same to other planets? Even to Earth itself, that question hung like a suspended blade, turning every calculation into dust. In the weeks that followed, orbital data from Phobos and Deimos grew so erratic that scientists could scarcely believe what appeared on their screens. Phobos's once smooth trajectory now sprawled like spilled ink across paper, while Deimos wobbled unpredictably, like a leaf caught in an invisible whirlwind. Computer models collapsed again and again, unable to project any stable orbit lasting more than a few months. The chaos left astronomers with the sense of staring into a collapsing womb, where every law had been torn apart by Atlas. Phobos, its fractured surface widening further, began emitting faint but irregular gravitational signals. One surviving satellite orbiting Mars recorded small bursts of dust and rock rising continuously from Phobos's crust, like fragments breaking off from a body dissolving piece by piece. Cracks stretching dozens of kilometers were likened to the death lines of fate, harbingers of an inevitable collapse. Deimos, though far smaller, carried its own dread, the threat of being flung free, wandering the solar system as an orphaned bullet with the potential to strike any planet or moon in the distant future. When simulations were released to the public, the world sank into horrified awe. Visuals of Phobos exploding into billions of shards, raining down upon Mars in an endless meteor storm, sent chills through audiences. Commentators described it as a planet consuming its own moon, a funeral feast in silence. Media headlines branded it the orbital death sentence, the moon's signed execution. Millions of viewers watched, unable to turn away, though the sight resembled a nightmare no one wished to witness twice. In research centers, the obsession deepened. One team concluded that if Phobos collapsed, its debris could form a chaotic ring around Mars, lasting centuries, a grim counterpart to Saturn's splendor. Unlike Saturn's majestic arcs, this ring would be nothing but a graveyard of rubble, ever poised to fall. It would doom every effort of colonization, for no dome could withstand meteor storms enduring for hundreds of years. Public perception of Atlas began to shift. Once imagined as the sower of life, or sender of mysterious signals, it now appeared as an invisible executioner. It needed no collision, no detonation. Its mere passing was enough to rewrite the destiny of an entire planet and its moons. This dread haunted not only scientists but ordinary citizens. If Mars could be turned into an orbital battlefield, was Earth truly safe? Could our own moon one day become a victim? Should Atlas, or something like it, drift past? And within each question, a deeper truth emerged. The chaos Atlas unleashed was not only physical, but psychological. It shattered the belief that the cosmos obeyed stable laws. It seeded into humanity's imagination a lasting terror that the sky was no longer an immutable dome, but something that could collapse at any moment, toppled by nothing more than a shadow passing from afar. July 2026. The latest simulation reports left the scientific community in a stunned, breathless silence. Supercomputers, running billions of calculations per second, all pointed to the same outcome. Phobos would collapse, not if, but when. The exact timing might vary from decades to a century, but its orbit had already entered an irreversible spiral. Phobos, the small grey jewel once hovering quietly above Mars, was now described as a ticking time bomb, waiting for the moment it would shatter. Computer-generated images showing Mars after Phobos's collapse left audiences worldwide breathless with shock. A meteor storm lasting thousands of years, turning the red planet's sky into a blazing funeral wreath. House-sized slabs of rock plunged downward, leaving crater upon crater, scarring the planet with fresh wounds. Some models even suggested that dust from Phobos could form a shroud around Mars, dimming sunlight for generations. Instead of a world for settlement, Mars would become a cosmic graveyard, bound in endless shadow and ceaseless stonefall. Deimos, the smaller surviving moon, fared no better in these scenarios. Either it would be flung from orbit, becoming a wandering asteroid, or it too would fragment, feeding the chaotic ring around the planet. Astronomers called it the Chaos Cloud, an endless mix of dust, rock, and ruin, a hellish counterpart to Saturn's rings. Yet while Saturn's rings shine with majestic beauty, the Martian cloud would be nothing but an open wound, bleeding rock and dust without end. On Earth, the sense of dread spread wide. Space security experts warned that fragments from such an event could be nudged off course, drifting through the vast orbital lanes with the eventual potential of crossing Earth's path. Some broadcasts even used the phrase cosmic shotgun, with Atlas having chambered the weapon and Phobos as the first bullet fired. Though the immediate risk was distant, the knowledge that such an orbital catastrophe was already scripted was enough to chill the public. In popular culture, the image of Mars wreathed in debris began haunting every work of art. Painters depicted a crimson sky. Spiraled bands of rubble wound around the planet like ropes tightening. Writers described humanity gazing upward from Earth, seeing in the distance a planet devouring its own moon, a death stretching across millennia. With no scream, only the cold glow of ruin. For the scientific world, Atlas was no longer simply an object of study. It had become a symbol of fragility, proof that a mere passing could be enough to rewrite the destiny of an entire system. And for humanity, the vision planted a lasting terror. If Mars could become an orbital grave, then what of Earth? With its gentle moon hanging above, Atlas had turned the sky from a refuge of dreams into a chilling reminder. Everything can collapse at any moment because of a stranger drifting by. August 2026. Before the world could recover from the looming vision of Phobos collapsing, an even more terrifying scenario emerged. The chain of chaos from Atlas might reach Earth itself. At first, it was little more than scattered whispers in orbital research groups. But soon, supercomputers began issuing the same warning. Fragments of Atlas, after being nudged by Martian gravity, could be pulled off course and drift into Earth-crossing trajectories within the coming decades. No one dared say a collision was certain, but the mere possibility was enough to plant a fear that stretched endlessly forward, a phantom shadow trailing every step of humanity. Experts turned to concepts once confined to textbooks: the Yarkovsky effect. This occurs when an asteroid or fragment absorbs sunlight on one side and re-emits it as heat, creating a tiny but constant push. Over decades, even centuries, that subtle force can completely alter an orbit, transforming an apparently harmless rock into a massive bullet aimed straight at the blue planet. In the case of Atlas, every drifting shard was like a die thrown into space, its landing face unknown. And the most frightening truth was this: the dice game would not end in days or months, but play out over an entire century, forcing humanity to live under the weight of permanent uncertainty. Another factor deepened the dread: gravitational resonance. As Atlas's fragments brushed past Mars or even neared the asteroid belt, they could be pushed into special orbits, where Earth's gravity and that of other planets would combine, prolonging their wandering while also amplifying the odds of eventual collision. Simulations showed that, beginning in the 2040 seconds, the probability, though small, never zero, would rise that fragments hundreds of meters wide might cut across Earth's orbital path. Even a figure as low as 0.1% was enough to thrust the world into a state of constant vigilance. When probability is not zero, it becomes a sword dangling above the whole of humanity. International media seized the warning and turned it into chilling headlines. They called it the invisible Doomsday clock, a clock that ticks without sound, displays no second hand, yet still counts down the days through fluctuations of gravity and heat radiation. The public began asking, if a 500-meter fragment from Atlas truly sped toward Earth, what tools did we have to stop it? Test missions like DART and the upcoming Hera were mentioned as faint rays of hope, but even specialists admitted they were designed for small, singular asteroids, not for hundreds of erratic shards born of an interstellar body. The blunt answer was simple: no one could say for sure, and that uncertainty itself became the real nightmare. This fear was not loud, but smoldered like fire beneath ash. Every news report, every orbital update, reminded humanity that Atlas was not only a Martian tragedy of the past, but also a shadow that could shape Earth's dark future. From this moment on, the blue planet was forced to live under a long haunting. Tomorrow might still be calm, but someday, fate could knock at the door in a way no one would ever be prepared to answer. On Earth, news of the invisible Doomsday clock spread like a storm. Governments, already exhausted by daily crises, now faced a scenario beyond any security playbook. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, but the speeches were filled with hollow diplomacy. We must strengthen international cooperation. We must place our trust in science. The world listened, but few believed. The naked truth was clear to all. No one possessed a tool to halt Atlas, no shield strong enough, no technology certain enough. Financial markets reacted first. Insurance prices soared, while aerospace companies saw their stocks swing wildly. Digital currencies became a temporary refuge, as if humanity sought comfort in cold lines of code against the dread falling from the sky. Economists warned the fear alone, stretched across years, could ignite a global financial crisis. When the future hangs suspended, no one dares invest in tomorrow. Meanwhile, the public lived in a state of psychological fragility. Every news bulletin, every updated orbital simulation broadcast, clenched the hearts of millions. Some began building shelters, some stockpiled food, but most simply endured the constant, gnawing anxiety. Social surveys revealed alarming spikes in anxiety and depression, especially among the young, the very generation raised on the dream of conquering Mars, now forced to face the possibility that even Earth might not remain safe. The media both amplified and fed on the fear. News channels looped animations of massive fragments streaking toward Earth, under shock headlines. When will Atlas's sword fall? Social networks swarmed with conspiracy theories, that governments knew more than they admitted, that Atlas was in fact an artificial construct, built by an alien civilization. In that atmosphere, the line between science and fiction blurred, leaving fertile ground for anxiety to erupt unchecked. The most terrifying part was the loss of control. Humanity had long believed in its ability to master nature. We build cities to withstand storms, dams to tame floods, and even plans to mine asteroids. But in the face of Atlas, all of it seemed small. We were reduced to passengers aboard a fragile vessel called Earth, peering through the cosmic window at a bullet, drifting out there, its aim uncertain, its timing unknown. In scientific conferences, probability figures were presented with clinical detachment, but beneath them lurked a chilling truth. Whether the risk was 0.1% or 0.01%, it still existed. And when weighed on the cosmic scale, the price was not a few cities, but the entirety of human civilization. That precarious balance ensured the fear did not erupt into immediate chaos, but instead seeped steadily into collective consciousness, a psychological cancer. Not one that killed outright, but one that gnawed silently at every night's sleep, every shard of faith, every plan for the future. By the end of 2026, the world entered winter under a shadow no one could see. Not a cloud, not a storm, but an obsession with a name, Atlas. In every international summit, the same question echoed until it became a haunting refrain. If one of its fragments truly veered toward Earth, what could we do? The answer, whether cloaked in diplomatic language or hidden beneath scientific models, was always the same: nothing at all. Space security experts called it an open countdown. No one knew when the clock might strike, or even if it ever would, but the fact that it existed at all was enough to turn each day into a waiting period. For the first time in history, Earth no longer looked at the future as a straight line of progress, but as a massive game of chance. We were not the players, nor the dealers. We were pawns swept into a cosmic match, watching Atlas roll dice across the cold expanse of space. Universities launched special courses on planetary impact risks, but students attended with a different gaze. They weren't there to prepare for careers, they came searching for explanations to ease the constant dread. Psychologists warned that young generations were being swallowed by a prolonged doomsday syndrome, a state of mind that emerges when people live too long under an undefined threat until they gradually lose faith in any long-term plan. People hesitated to marry, to have children, to build careers. The future was no longer a dream, but a blank void that Atlas had claimed for itself. In popular culture, images of Atlas and its fragments appeared everywhere, in paintings, films, and music. But the romance was gone. Instead, it became an emblem of unease, a faint green halo in the distance, a blinking dot on an orbital map, a hidden pulse in electronic soundscapes. All carried the same reminder that we lived beneath a cosmic sword of Damocles, suspended by a thread that could snap at any moment. The most frightening part was not the prospect of impact, but the absolute loss of control. Humanity had grown used to calculating everything: the route of high-speed trains, the heartbeat in an operating room, even the average lifespan of a society. Yet against Atlas, all those numbers were fragile, swept aside by a cold, drifting stone. Suddenly, we realized that this civilization, with all its science, technology, and power, was little more than a candle burning in the wind, ready to be extinguished at any time. As 2026 came to a close, a quiet message spread across humanity. Atlas had turned the future into a game in which mankind held no pieces, and in that game, terror was not in the final collision, but in the waiting in each day lived under the shadow of uncertainty. That was the cruelest truth of all. The horror lay not in death itself, but in the endless anticipation of death, the waiting without knowing when it would end. Early 2027. As news of Atlas's fragments continued to rattle the world, a new fear emerged, quieter, but one that gripped scientists' hearts more tightly than the apocalyptic scenarios. Humanity's fleet of spacecraft was becoming Atlas's hostages. Not soldiers, not cities, but the intricate machines, our mechanical eyes and hands, that humanity had spent decades sending into the void. Now they trembled in space, facing the risk of being erased by nothing more than invisible dust. When Atlas swept past Mars, it left behind an immense tail of plasma dust stretching millions of kilometers. That haze was filled with countless charged particles, smaller than grains of sand, but racing at terrifying speeds tens of kilometers per second. At such velocity, a single particle could punch through a spacecraft's titanium shield, the way a bullet shatters fragile glass. Experts warned, even one tiny impact could cripple an entire solar array, turning a multi-billion-dollar spacecraft into a lifeless husk, drifting in darkness. In the first days of the year, NASA and ESA control centers went on constant alert. Engineers were forced to shift satellites into defensive mode, folding solar panels and adjusting flight paths to minimize surface exposure. Yet these measures felt like acts of desperation, like a soldier holding up a paper shield against a rain of bullets. The James Webb Space Telescope, the most precious eye humanity had ever placed in orbit, suffered several brief signal losses that left the entire world holding its breath. In Houston, just a few seconds of silence on the console plunged the control room into stillness, no one daring to breathe. When the signal returned, a wave of exhalations echoed at once, as if the whole planet had just survived a heart attack. On Mars, probes reported disturbing anomalies, magnetometer readings spiking erratically, images smeared with strange streaks of light, temperature sensors producing impossible fluctuations. These weren't just errors, they were haunting distortions, making humanity feel blindfolded in the desert of space. Some scientists, with chilling detachment, recorded the phrase in their reports, "blind humanity's robotic presence." Our mechanical existence in the cosmos was slowly going blind. The tension spread beyond the control rooms, seeping into the public. Every time a news update mentioned a spacecraft losing signal for minutes, millions of people on Earth flinched. To them, those ships were no longer distant metal shells. They had become symbols of human aspiration. They were eyes peering into the dark, hands reaching toward distant stars. And now, as each craft trembled under the cold might of Atlas, humanity felt a gnawing sorrow. Decades of labor, thousands of brilliant minds, billions of dollars all could vanish in a single breath of plasma. Atlas needed no impact, no explosion. It was enough to turn humanity's greatest scientific triumphs into a cosmic game of chance. And in that game, the losers were not just the machines, but all of humankind, a species that had bound its future to fragile vessels, now slowly breaking under the invisible wrath of the universe. One by one, each spacecraft became a protagonist in the tragedy, written by Atlas. James Webb, the greatest symbol of the 21st century, was no longer the window to the universe, but rather an aging eye trembling before a storm of dust. In February 2027, engineers reported that Webb's primary mirror had begun to show microscopic scratches. These were not manufacturing flaws, but scars left by particles from Atlas's tail. Each scratch was like a drop of blood on a retina. They were not enough to blind Webb, but they blurred his vision, dimming the sharpness of distant observations. Astronomers described the feeling as if the eye of humanity was slowly being veiled by a cosmic mist that could never be wiped away. On Mars, Perseverance and Curiosity, the two steadfast rovers, shared the same fate. Perseverance's signal antenna repeatedly faltered, like a flag shredded by storm winds. Data packets sent to Earth arrived corrupted, fractured, leaving images of the red planet streaked with eerie light. Engineers tried to recover the information but found themselves powerless before the chaos in the numbers, like doctors watching a patient slip away without knowing the cause. Curiosity, already aging, reported constant failures in its navigation system. Some days, it fell silent for hours, leaving mission control to believe it had drawn its last breath. When the signal returned, relief swept the room, but everyone knew its precious hours were running out. Even satellites orbiting Earth were no longer safe. Observatories detected strange electromagnetic disturbances rippling through the upper atmosphere. Some communication satellites flickered, losing signal for mere seconds, yet enough to disrupt coordination systems. Engineers described it as the shadow of Atlas, brushing across the low-orbit network, making the entire planet shudder. For the public, these brief interruptions felt like cold reminders that millions of kilometers of distance could not shield them from the invisible hand of the interstellar wanderer. Scientists, long practiced in composure, now betrayed their strain. At press conferences, their eyes were ringed with exhaustion. Their voices quivered when they spoke of the risk of a blind humanity's robotic presence. They knew each of those spacecraft embodied decades of labor, billions of dollars, and thousands of dreams. Losing them meant not just the loss of instruments, but the collapse of faith in humanity's ability to leave a lasting mark beyond Earth. Every time a signal went dark, they did not merely see a zero on the screen, they saw years of work dissolving into dust, scattered into the void. For the public, the grief was even sharper. Children who had grown up watching Webb peer into the cosmos, who had waited in awe for Perseverance's first images, now had to witness those mechanical heroes falter, adrift in Atlas's storm. Many parents confessed they didn't know how to answer when their children asked, "So who will keep looking out there for us now?" That simple, haunting question jolted humanity awake. We had placed too much trust in fragile mechanical eyes, and when those eyes closed, we were no different from the blind adrift in an endless, indifferent universe. March 2027. A string of technical failures slowly revealed to the world that this was no longer a series of isolated malfunctions, but a silent extinction of humanity's scientific machines. The media gave it a chilling name: the mechanical funeral of humankind. There was no black smoke, no thunderous explosion, only control screens going dark one by one, leaving behind silent columns of data. Each lost craft was like a star going out, and with it, a fragment of human intellect vanished into the cosmic night. When news broke that Curiosity, the rover that had rolled across the Martian surface for more than a decade, had stopped responding, the world fell silent. Engineers sent hundreds of restart commands, all swallowed by the endless void. In the end, they were forced to declare that Curiosity had gone silent forever. In mission control, many wept, knowing this was not merely the death of a robot, but a farewell to an entire generation of exploration. Curiosity had once discovered traces of ancient water, had once kindled hope for life, and now it lay upon the red planet like a lonely steel tomb. Soon after, bad news struck Perseverance. Its signal blackouts stretched longer. Its image data degenerated into meaningless strings of characters. Scientists described the feeling as listening to a comatose patient struggling for breath through a ventilator. They knew Perseverance was fading with each passing day, and that before long, it too would be nothing but a metal ghost lying motionless on the Martian dust. That silence paralyzed more than science. It suffocated the human spirit. Dreams once illuminated by sharp images from Mars were now reduced to oppressive darkness. In orbit, many satellites began to suffer permanent failures. Some were crippled when their solar panels failed, drifting aimlessly like abandoned wrecks. Others lost all contact, leaving permanent black gaps in the monitoring network. Scientists called it progressive blindness. Telescope by telescope, antenna by antenna, every eye was being veiled by Atlas, fragmenting humanity's presence in space into a broken web. We remained on Earth, but out there in the dark, our mechanical soldiers were collapsing one by one. The public, long accustomed to the glory of space missions, was forced to face the unfolding tragedy. Children who had once cheered when Perseverance touched down now had to hear that it would not wake up again. Families who had once turned on the television to marvel at James Webb's first images now watched them fade day by day. And in each pang of grief, a quiet question arose. Had we been too naive to believe we could conquer the universe? Atlas did not need to fire a bullet or cause an explosion. It merely existed, and with its plasma dust, tail, and electromagnetic resonance, it accomplished what centuries of astronomy had never faced. It blindfolded humanity. With no more telescopic eyes, no more robotic hands, we stood staring into the vastness of space with nothing but our frail human vision. And in that suffocating silence, a tragic truth became undeniable. Atlas had turned humanity's pride into a mechanical graveyard, suspended among the stars. Summer 2027. While humanity was still mourning the mechanical graveyard, drifting in space, a new nightmare struck this time, not robbing us of our eyes, but attacking the very nervous system of global communication. In mid-June, a wave of radio astronomy stations reported the same phenomenon. From the direction of space where Atlas drifted, strange signals were emerging. At first, they were described as interference within a cosmic storm, massive surges of electromagnetic waves sweeping through, wiping clean entire displays. But as the data was carefully analyzed, dread crept in. Within that sea of chaotic noise were repeating sequences, cold and precise, beating like the mechanical heart of an unseen being. Leaked reports revealed that these waveforms were not random, they had structure. Certain stretches lengthened, paused, then returned at exactly fixed intervals. Astronomers did not call it a language, yet everyone sensed it resembled an encoded message. Even the most skeptical scientists were forced to admit this could not be dismissed as an everyday anomaly. The signals carried an intentionality so stark it drove the entire scientific community into a state of taut, breathless tension. The moment news escaped the labs, it became a global earthquake. On television, snippets of the distorted sound were broadcast, crackling static, interwoven with eerie rhythmic pulses that terrified millions of viewers. It was neither music nor machine noise. It rang out like metal tapping on a coffin wall, over and over, until the repetition became unbearable. Social media erupted. Short audio clips were shared millions of times within hours, transforming Atlas into the silent mouth that speaks, a colossal presence hanging motionless in the void. Inside the scientific world, debate turned into firestorms. One faction tried to calm the public, suggesting the signals might simply be caused by Atlas's plasma tail interacting with solar radiation, creating oscillations that only appeared deliberate. But the opposing camp rejected this fiercely. The repetitions were too precise, too deliberate, to be dismissed as chance. A group of specialists went further, warning that if these signals truly were the product of intelligence, then humanity was staring at the first evidence of extraterrestrial technology, and technology so far beyond us that it was terrifying. While laboratories argued, the real world began to suffer. Telecommunications satellites reported interference strong enough to cause widespread outages. Air traffic radar flickered, forcing thousands of flights to be delayed or rerouted. Within weeks, the world's largest stock exchanges lost trillions of dollars as investors fled in panic, as though the global economy itself had been strangled by an invisible hand. Security experts described the spectacle as trillions of dollars in damage inflicted by an electromagnetic storm no one could control. For the public, already living in the shadow of fear from previous months, this was another unbearable truth. Atlas was not only capable of blinding humanity, but could also silence Earth itself, cutting us off from the very infrastructure on which our survival depended. And in that heavy, suffocating atmosphere, one question echoed through every boardroom, every news broadcast, every online conversation. What is Atlas trying to say, and who is the message for? The debate over Atlas's signals quickly erupted into a global political scientific storm. At emergency summits, clashing voices rang out, like the planet itself was being torn in two. One camp insisted the signals were nothing more than natural consequences, the product of a cosmic storm, created when Atlas's plasma tail collided with solar radiation, generating oscillations that only seemed orderly. There is no intelligence here, they stressed, only physics and chaos. But the opposing camp, many of them respected, scientists pushed back with fury. To them, the repeating rhythm was far too precise, far too deliberate to be explained away as a coincidence. Some reports stated bluntly, "We may be hearing the voice of another civilization." The media fanned the flames into a global earthquake. Major newspapers splashed headlines across their front pages. Signals from the abyss. Will you trust science or believe in alien intelligence? Is Atlas trying to warn humanity? Social media dissolved into frenzy. Millions shared the same haunting question. If this was a message, what did it mean? Some believed it was a greeting. Others, trembling, feared it was a warning, or worse, a death sentence handed down to humankind. In an atmosphere thick with dread, every theory, no matter how outlandish, was embraced as a real possibility. As the public spiraled into hysteria, the practical fallout only deepened the chaos. Telecom corporations reported losses of hundreds of billions of dollars each week due to outages. Stock markets plummeted, dragging global psychology into panic. Security analysts grimly noted that the mere existence of Atlas's signal had already caused trillions of dollars in damage to the world economy, and the most terrifying truth was that no one knew when, or if, it would end. Airlines, reliant on radar and satellite networks, were forced to cancel thousands of flights. Night after night, millions of stranded passengers stared at starry skies through airport windows, their eyes hollow with despair. Inside emergency war rooms, helplessness became undeniable. There was no technology to switch off the signal, no plan capable of shielding global communication. Leaders were forced to confess before their citizens that humanity no longer controlled its own technological destiny. One analogy spread through the corridors of power. We are like spiders trapped in our own web. Atlas only needs to touch it, and the whole structure trembles, ready to snap. The terror spread not just because of the threat of broken communication, but because of the terrifying implication behind the signal itself. If it was truly the product of intelligence, then humanity was being watched or tested. If it were merely a natural phenomenon, The fact that we were powerless against a repeating frequency was already enough to expose the fragility of our civilization. Either way, the result was the same. Humanity was pushed into a permanent state of dread, forced to live with the knowledge that any wire, any signal, any network could fracture at any moment. And amid the chaos, the darkest question lingered unanswered, unanswerable. Was Atlas sending a message or reading out the obituary of the human race? September 2027. The signal from Atlas did not fade with time. On the contrary, it grew sharper, as if an invisible hand were tightening its grip on the antennas of all humanity. The once simple, repeating sequences now stretched longer, more complex, some even overlapped with frequency bands used by commercial aviation and military satellites. Experts warned, if this is a coincidence, it is the cruelest coincidence in history. If not, then someone is deliberately aiming straight at us. Global control centers plunged into red alert. Satellite fleets were forced offline as interference reached levels that made them uncontrollable. Several national defense radars reported being completely blinded for hours at a time, leaving borders on Earth as exposed as open doors. Security analysts began using words never before seen in official documents: global blackout scenario. If the signal persisted for only a few more weeks, communications, trade, finance, and defense systems could collapse like dominoes. The public spiraled into panic. News broadcasts showed endless footage of cancelled flights, abandoned trading floors, and cities sinking into darkness as smart grids faltered without stable data. Citizens rushed to buy old-fashioned radios, desperate for ways to connect without satellites. On social media, the phrase "Atlas Doomsday" exploded into a worldwide trend. Snippets of the recorded signal, the cold, repetitive pulses were remixed into electronic tracks, thundering through nightclubs where young people danced in feverish ecstasy, suspended between euphoria and the terror of annihilation. A civilization trembling at the edge of collapse tried, in despair, to consume its own fear. In scientific conferences, once proud faces now carried only helplessness. No technology was powerful enough to block the signal. No laboratory dared to claim it could define its true nature. Some scientists, in moments of desperation, whispered that this was no longer science but judgment. If Atlas carried an alien intelligence, then humanity was being tested. If not, the very inability to distinguish nature from intent was already enough to expose the fragility of mankind. Terror peaked when an independent research group published its discovery. Atlas's signal appeared to synchronize with Earth's rotation. Every 24 hours, the repeating pattern shifted, as though it were counting our own time. Their report ended with a sentence that sent chills across the globe. If this is a message, it is not about us. It is to us. The planet fell into silence after that revelation. Deep down, everyone understood. This was no longer a scientific puzzle waiting to be solved, but a verdict hanging over our heads. Atlas had turned its signal into an apocalypse bell, tolling across the sky like a death knell. And in the face of absolute helplessness, humanity could do nothing but tremble and listen, waiting for the next pulse to strike, like the cold knocking of the abyss itself, warning that the game had begun and we were nothing more than pawns swept along by its will. Late 2027. While the cold signal from Atlas still echoed across the skies, a series of new scientific reports cast an even darker shadow over humanity's collective mind. Orbital stations circling Mars began to register unusual fluctuations in the planet's atmosphere. A sudden surge in dust density, erratic swings in pressure, and, most alarming of all, unstable pockets of localized heat. The source? The dust and gases from Atlas's tail, now seeping into the upper layers of the Martian atmosphere. The result was the birth of colossal dust storms, swallowing plains and cloaking entire continents in crimson fog. Some satellite analyses even revealed traces of exotic organic compounds capable of entering new chemical cycles. Scientists delivered their bitter verdict. Atlas had touched Mars, leaving behind a form of terraforming by accident. The irony cut like a knife across humanity's pride. For decades, we had dreamed of turning Mars into a second home. Governments and corporations poured trillions into research, launching fleets of probes, drafting plans to seed microbes, and release CO2 to thicken the atmosphere. Dome city designs and hydroponic farm models were drawn and presented at global conferences, even printed in school textbooks as promises for the next generation. Yet in the end, It was not the hand of humankind, but an interstellar cloud of ice and dust that carried out the first act of terraforming. And it did not bring paradise. It opened the gates of hell. Mars's climate began to veer into chaos. Hotter days, colder nights, the temperature gradient swinging violently beyond projections. Atmospheric pressure rose in some regions but collapsed in others, leaving the surface a patchwork of instability, offering hope and despair in equal measure. The relentless dust storms did not just block sunlight. They also crippled orbital satellites, cutting signals in and out. The planet resembled a shattered laboratory, where every test tube had been flung against the wall, leaving only chaos in place of results. "This is not Mars reborn," one researcher lamented. "This is Mars, cursed." Editorials around the globe carried the same bitterness. "We dreamed of heaven, but Atlas gave us hell." One satirical paper sneered, "Humanity spends trillions to fantasize, while the universe only needs to sneeze once to turn the dream into a nightmare." These sharp words spread quickly, capturing the mood perfectly. Humanity had wagered its future on the dream of colonizing Mars, only to watch that dream collapse in ashes. In academic forums, the phrase nightmare scenario began to surface as a definitive full stop. What had once been speculation was now reality. A planet, not as a sanctuary, but as a failed experiment. A place where every human plan was turned into cosmic mockery by forces utterly indifferent. And within this grim realization, a deeper truth emerged. Perhaps Atlas had never been the true enemy at all. Perhaps it was humanity's own naive ambition that had transformed the dream into a living hell. In early November 2027, every news broadcast opened with the same image. Mars swallowed by a dust storm, a crimson halo engulfing half the planet. But the greater shock came from the latest analyses relayed by the few surviving satellites. The Martian atmosphere had begun to change in measurable ways. Carbon dioxide levels spiked abnormally, accompanied by methane concentrations never before detected at such intensity. Some laboratories cautiously labeled it an unpredicted chain of chemical reactions, but the public had already given it another name: the terraforming accident. The irony was merciless. For decades, humanity had dreamed of pumping CO2 into the Martian atmosphere to thicken it, to trap more heat, to prepare the ground for life. Plans drafted by NASA, ESA, and even SpaceX had all emphasized the same hope. If we can trigger an artificial greenhouse effect, Mars will become livable. But now, with Atlas scattering chaos into the skies, that very effect was happening not as a dream realized, but as a nightmare unfolding. Temperatures soared in some regions and plunged without warning in others, creating swings harsher than before. Atmospheric pressure lurched like a drunkard swelling, collapsing, turning the Martian surface into nothing more than a failed experiment on a planetary scale. The scientists, once the torchbearers of the settlement dream, now stood as unwilling witnesses to its disfigurement. Some spoke bitterly. "We imagined terraforming as art, but Atlas has turned it into a farce." In the press, biting words spread like wildfire. Atlas accomplished what trillions of dollars could not, but it did it wrong, and it can never be undone. The public read these lines and managed hollow laughs, but behind the laughter lay humiliation and grief. The grandest dream of humanity had been mocked in plain sight before billions of eyes. In scientific conferences, gloom settled like a heavy fog. The charts projected onto screens resembled death certificates for the Martian project. One elderly scholar whispered, "This is not terraforming. This is deforming, bending a planet out of shape." His phrase spread, quickly turning into a bitter slogan. Instead of reviving a world, Atlas had twisted it into a laboratory of permanent chaos. Among the public, the despair seeped far beyond science into the core of spiritual life. Many confessed they felt betrayed. After years of believing in the promise that Mars will be our second home, they were now forced to watch that home shattered before it was ever built. Some mocked grimly, "Perhaps Atlas is the real terraformer. It has shown us that reshaping a planet is not a dream, but the universe's default nightmare." Thanks for watching. It all crystallized into a single shared bitterness. Humanity had poured its hopes and its fortune into turning Mars into paradise, yet Atlas, with nothing more than a passing glance, had turned it into a nightmare script. And within that darkness, humankind was left facing a truth sharper than any blade. Sometimes, the universe does not destroy your dream. With violence, it destroys it with irony, by twisting that dream into the worst version of itself. December 2027. Mars, once hailed as the second home of humanity, was now described with chilling phrases: failed laboratory, terraforming accident, nightmare scenario. Reports from the few surviving satellites painted a bleak picture, an atmosphere convulsing like a dying patient, dust storms following one after another, and the once barren red soil now layered with strange chemical compounds whose consequences no one could predict. Instead of sowing hope, Atlas had seeded a grotesque experiment, a planet bent out of shape, not by human ambition, but by the indifference of the cosmos. The scientific community no longer argued. They looked at the data and sighed. Some were so pessimistic they called it the death certificate of Mars. For if once we could still dream of shaping it, now its entire environment had been broken by Atlas in irreversible ways. Terraforming by accident sounded like a cruel cosmic joke. Humanity longed to master nature, yet nature acted first, ruining every plan in the process. One philosopher wrote bitterly, "We wanted to make Mars a paradise, but Atlas sneezed and turned it into hell." The public reacted with a mixture of bitterness and sarcasm. On social media, the phrase "Nightmare Mars" trended worldwide. People spliced images of futuristic dome cities with terrifying dust storms and captioned them, "Welcome to your second home, the Nightmare Laboratory." These jokes, though mocking, masked a deeper truth. Disappointment had sunk so deep that humanity could only laugh at itself to endure it. Newspapers joined in, with biting lines such as, "Atlas completed the terraforming project before we even began." The sarcasm spread widely, becoming the bitter medicine that allowed people to swallow reality. Within this atmosphere, a philosophical reflection began to surface. Perhaps Atlas was not only a bringer of catastrophe, but also a mirror exposing humanity's contradictions. We had shouted slogans about conquering the cosmos, but when the cosmos responded, all we could do was retreat into fear and bitterness. We had placed faith in technology, but in the face of a cold celestial visitor, every technology became a farce. We called it an accident, yet perhaps in the eyes of the universe, it was simply a natural cycle, the irony being that humanity kept imagining itself the center. By the end of 2027, in year-end editorials, the phrase "nightmare scenario" appeared everywhere. No one spoke of Martian colonies anymore. No one sketched visions of dome cities under a red sky. Instead, all acknowledged a sobering truth. The planet once promised as a second home had turned into a brutal reminder that dreams can morph into nightmares at any moment. And Atlas, the cold interstellar wanderer, had proven this without bombs, without collisions, without destruction. It needed only a passing glance to erase faith and twist ambition into the cruelest joke in human history. The year 2028. Humanity entered the new year not with dazzling fireworks, but with uneasy silence. Cities that once echoed with cheers now offered only scattered bursts of firecrackers, muffled beneath a heavy atmosphere. For Atlas, after all the upheavals of 2026 and 2027, it was no longer a mere astronomical event. It had become a global psychological symbol. It appeared everywhere, painted on murals in public squares, pulsing in electronic music that mimicked its repeating signals, flickering through films, even woven into the rituals of newly formed religions. People imagined Atlas as a vast emerald eye, suspended in the heavens, watching humanity with a gaze both silent and haunting. Its radio pulses were transformed into hypnotic beats in nightclubs, where young people danced beneath strobe lights, exhilarated yet shivering. Atlas, once just a soulless mass of ice and dust, had become a silent god of the modern age. Psychologists called this phenomenon a collective crisis of faith. Humanity, long accustomed to placing trust in science, now confronted the truth that science had no definitive answers. Orbital models collapsed, predictions failed, satellites died one after another in silence, all of it forcing the public to see the limits of science. Religion fared no better. No scripture had ever spoken of Atlas. No doctrine had prepared believers for such a vision. The result was a vast void in the collective consciousness. That void was quickly filled with conspiracy theories. Some claimed Atlas was a secret weapon deployed by a superpower to control the world. Others insisted it was the Noah's Ark of an alien civilization, observing Earth as a laboratory. Fringe sects proclaimed Atlas as a sign of Judgment Day, proof that the end was near. On social media, millions argued endlessly, yet they all shared one thing in common. No one dared to place absolute faith in anything anymore. The true terror lay not in the theories themselves, but in the collapse of trust. With science powerless and religion silent, humanity turned to doubt everything. Every dataset released was accused of being fabricated, every government statement dismissed as a cover-up. In that state, Atlas crossed the boundary of being a celestial object and became a new myth of mankind, a myth without answers, built only from scattered fragments, retold in countless versions, each saturated with despair. Atlas, therefore, no longer lingered only in the sky but burrowed deep into the human mind. It became a mirror reflecting the fragility of civilization, where faith was eroded, leaving behind a slow-burning collective fear. Not a fear that screamed, but a fear that dripped steadily, day after day, forcing humanity into a constant state of waiting for another signal, waiting for an explanation, or waiting for a final judgment. And within that waiting, a dark realization settled into every soul. Perhaps Atlas had not come to destroy us, but to reveal the truth that we had never truly been in control of our fate. In 2028, Atlas was no longer just a scientific phenomenon. It had become an unwilling muse for art and faith alike. In New York, an exhibition titled The Silent God displayed paintings of Atlas as a colossal mask suspended in the cosmos, its hollow eyes staring down at humanity. In Tokyo, a group of street artists transformed the repeating rhythm of its radio signal into strings of graffiti symbols across subway walls, a coded warning written in paint. In Berlin, electronic musicians remixed the signal into soundscapes for live performances, where audiences danced ecstatically yet shivered as they realized they were moving to the pulse of an alien body. Religion, too, was shaken. New sects emerged, proclaiming Atlas as the messenger of judgment, the cosmic eye, sent to observe and weigh mankind. In South America, thousands gathered beneath the night sky, chanting that Atlas was the omen of Earth's rebirth. In Europe, priests countered bluntly, "This is no god, only a cold stone." Yet even that denial could not erase the truth within the collective psyche. Atlas had stepped into the very space once reserved for deities, the supreme symbol of human helplessness. In everyday life, Atlas became a constant obsession. Children sketched it during art class instead of drawing the sun or moon. Adults joked bitterly, "See you under Atlas's shadow," as though arranging to meet at a cafe. Even language absorbed it. The Atlas effect became shorthand for any event beyond human control, a sardonic way of admitting that every plan could collapse in an instant. This spread revealed a bitter truth. When people could no longer find certainty in science or solace in religion, they turned to art, culture, and even satire to soothe themselves. Yet rather than heal, this only deepened the wound of collective mistrust. A painting of Atlas might be beautiful, a remix might be exhilarating, but both carried the same reminder: we are dancing at the edge of an abyss, decorating the nightmare with colors and sound, yet never erasing the fact that the abyss still yawns beneath us. In public discourse, Atlas was often compared to ancient myths, Prometheus bringing fire, Pandora opening her box, and Noah's Ark carrying hope. But unlike those myths, the Atlas of the modern age brought no gift, no hope, no salvation. It simply existed silent, indifferent, while humanity wove stories around it. And within that weaving, the deepest reflection emerged. Perhaps this entire civilization is nothing more than a machine designed to create new myths, filling the void of faith we dare not confront directly. By the end of 2028, Atlas had drifted far beyond the reach of direct observation, reduced to nothing more than a faint speck in the night sky. And yet, paradoxically, it had never been more vividly present in the human mind. On news broadcasts, in parliamentary chambers, in coffee shops, even in hushed private conversations, the name Atlas surfaced like a ghost. No one argued any more about its physical nature. Every dataset had led only to dead ends. Instead, what lingered was the spiritual and social meaning it had left behind. And here, a deeper contemplative mood prevailed, as humanity faced a painful question: who are we, truly, in this vast universe? The collective fear remained, but it had changed color. Gone were the public outcries and street panics. In their place settled a heavy silence. Sociologists called it the era of prolonged disbelief, a condition where humanity no longer trusted science for certainty, nor religion for salvation. Conspiracy theories still circulated, but they were told now with irony rather than conviction. Some claimed Atlas was an alien weapon, others swore it was a mirror reflecting humanity's soul, but all admitted the same thing: no one had enough faith left to distinguish truth from falsehood. In art and culture, Atlas evolved into a global symbol of reflection. In Paris, an installation titled Mirrors of Silence invited visitors into a darkened room containing only a single giant mirror, inscribed with the words, "Atlas never disappeared. It is in your gaze." Thousands stood before it, staring into their own eyes until tears welled up. In Peru, storytellers wove Atlas into ancient legends as a new deity testing humankind. In Hollywood, films inspired by its silent message multiplied, turning collective unease into apocalyptic dramas that audiences consumed with both dread and fascination. The paradox was clear. Within the collapse of old faiths, a new form of belief was born, not a faith in answers, but in acceptance. People began to learn to live with uncertainty, instead of demanding explanations for every mystery. Philosophers named it the post-Atlas psyche, the realization that the silence of the universe is not a void to be filled, but a mirror reflecting the limits of humanity itself. By refusing to speak, Atlas had forced humankind to confront the truth that we had never truly been in control of our destiny, and perhaps never would be. As 2028 came to a close, some journalists wrote, "Atlas is not the one delivering judgment, Atlas is the judgment itself." For the verdict lay not in data, but in collective fear, in the collapse of trust, in the tears shed before an invisible mirror. Humanity understood that the most terrifying thing was not Atlas threatening destruction, but Atlas compelling us to look back at ourselves in a universe indifferent, where every dream can turn into a nightmare with nothing more than a passing glance from the distant sky. Early 2029. After 2 years steeped in a crisis of faith, humanity began turning a new page, a chapter of curiosity. Atlas, once the harbinger of fear and obsession, had now become the most scrutinized target in the history of SETI. Scientists no longer asked, "What is it?" They asked instead, "Is it trying to say something to us?" And within that question, a strange mix of eagerness and trepidation seeped into every night shift, every number dancing across radar screens, every radio frequency under decoding. The great radio telescopes vast in China, Green Bank in the United States, Meerkat in South Africa, swiveled their massive antennas toward the orbital path Atlas had once crossed. Every flicker of electromagnetic disturbance, no matter how faint, was logged, analyzed, and compared millions of times. In the control rooms, the air was thick with tension. Screens displayed waveforms repeating like the pulse of an artificial heartbeat. Engineers and physicists sat in silence, eyes locked on every ripple. One of them whispered, "Maybe this is the first time the universe has ever whispered to us." The media quickly seized on this mood. Live streams from SETI facilities drew in millions of viewers. Audiences across the globe fixed their gaze on those inscrutable bands of waves, then rushed to interpret them. Some insisted it was mathematical language. Others swore it was an ancient song echoing from the bottom of the cosmos. Still others trembled, claiming it was a warning. Whatever the truth, for the first time in history, humanity felt it stood at the edge of a cosmic conversation, a conversation we were not sure we were ready to fully hear. Within the scientific community, fierce debate erupted. One faction believed this could be the first evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. They invoked the Fermi paradox, the age-old question of why the universe, so vast and full of stars, had remained silent. "Perhaps Atlas is the answer," they said, the first reply after millions of years of quiet. But others urged caution. They argued the signals could be nothing more than physical noise, born of plasma and magnetic fields. "Don't be so quick to ascribe this to intelligence," one astronomer warned, "or we may only be staring into a mirror of ourselves in the void." Among the public, curiosity caught fire. People rushed to build homemade radios, scanning for signals and streaming their finds online. Static-filled recordings were remixed into electronic tracks, pulsing in nightclubs where crowds danced feverishly, half thrilled and half afraid. In turning uncertainty into entertainment, civilization found a way to cope with the unknown. Yet hidden beneath the excitement was a quiet dread. If this was a greeting, it could open the door to a new era. But if it was a warning, then perhaps it was nothing less than a death knell sent from the distant dark. Balanced on that knife's edge, humanity entered 2029 with hearts trembling and expectant. Atlas, the cold celestial body that had once unleashed nightmares, had transformed into the single greatest question in human history. Is someone out there trying to make contact? And if so, what do they want us to hear? The scientific debates over Atlas were becoming less technical and more philosophical. At international conferences, one theme kept resurfacing: the Fermi paradox, the famous cosmic riddle that asks, if intelligent life is widespread, why have we never heard from anyone? Since 1950, that question had hung like a challenge, unanswered. And now, with the arrival of Atlas, many believed the paradox was beginning to crack. Perhaps we've never heard from anyone before, one scientist remarked, because this is the first time the universe has spoken, and Atlas is that whisper. But curiosity carried with it a shadow of dread, for if this was truly the first whisper, its meaning was double-edged. On one hand, it could be evidence of hope. We are not alone, the universe is not only silent, and intelligence beyond humanity may exist. On the other hand, it could be evidence of something terrifying. The silence was not because no one was there, but because everyone had already been forced into silence. In that vision, Atlas's signal was not a greeting, but the footprint of the last survivor in a universe once teeming with life. Within philosophy, Atlas became a mirror held up to humanity's spiritual void. Some compared it to a book suddenly falling from the shelves of the cosmic library, startling us with the realization that the library was not empty. But others cautioned, not every book carries knowledge, some contain curses. The question burrowed into the public mind: should we open Atlas's letter, or leave it sealed inside the envelope? At the social level, curiosity rippled into a cultural undertow. Major newspapers ran headlines tinged with both hope and fear. Atlas, friend or foe? Is the universe calling our name? On social media, signal decoding groups mushroomed overnight. People downloaded radio wave data from SETI, spinning wild theories, Fibonacci codes, galactic maps, encrypted messages. Each idea, however baseless, drew millions of comments, as if the entire human race were playing a cosmic puzzle game together. And that game stirred both exhilaration and unease, the haunting suspicion that the answer might be too terrible to accept. The most cautious scientists returned to the concept of the Great Silence, the billions of years during which the cosmos has remained wordless. They warned, there is a reason for that silence. If Atlas has broken it, then this is either the greatest opportunity in history or the gravest risk imaginable. Curiosity urged humanity to keep listening, but anxiety whispered back, sometimes silence itself is the final shield. And it was precisely in that space between curiosity, hope, and fear that Atlas became the center of a debate unlike any in human history. It was no longer merely a frozen, dusty body drifting through the void. It had become a living philosophical question, forcing humanity to choose, step into the darkness in search of an answer, or accept the silence, and live forever with a longing that can never be satisfied. Early summer of 2029. While telescopes continued their quiet vigil, scanning for Atlas's elusive signal, a new question began to haunt the scientific community. Should we answer? It was no longer a joke tossed around in forums, but a subject of serious debate inside United Nations chambers and SETI councils. Curiosity urged humanity to send a reply, a sign that Earth harbored life, intelligence, and a readiness to engage in dialogue. But intertwined with that longing was a deep unease. Would answering mean exposing our location to a power we could not possibly understand? Meetings stretched for hours, arguments colliding like storms. The advocates insisted that silence meant letting slip a once-in-a-millennium chance. If Atlas truly carries an alien intelligence, they said, this may be the first moment we can step out of cosmic solitude. We cannot just stand still and watch. But the opponents pointed grimly to Earth's own history. When two civilizations first meet, the weaker often disappears. Silence is the only fragile armor we still have, they warned. The debate spilled out into the public, and the world seemed split in two between the hope of connection and the dread of annihilation. Across society, the idea of answering Atlas ignited imagination. Artists designed messages with images of DNA, the tree of life, and maps of our blue planet cosmic business cards for a stranger. Some tech groups experimented with simulated mathematical languages they hoped would act as a universal code, convinced that numbers were the shared foundation of any intelligence. Yet, alongside such creativity came chilling warnings. If the message were decoded as an invitation, it could mark Earth as prey. Instead of connection, humanity might accidentally open its door to a predator. The public lived in a half-dream, half-fear. Television aired speculative programs dramatizing the first day of contact, where humanity spoke with extraterrestrial minds. Those shows brimmed with hope, sharing knowledge, curing diseases, unlocking the stars themselves. But woven into them were darker nightmares, fleets hovering in our skies, civilizations erased for daring to reply. Each night, millions of people went to bed, trembling yet excited, wondering, if tomorrow we send a signal, how will the future change? And gradually, amid that heavy anticipation, a collective reflection took shape. Atlas was not just a scientific puzzle, it was a psychological test. It forced humanity to confront itself, to see its yearning to reach outward, and its terror of extinction, its hope for friends in the cosmos, and its fear of invisible hunters. Atlas had become a vast mirror, showing Earth its own contradictions in stark clarity. By the end of 2029, no final decision had been reached. Would humanity remain silent, listening in the dark, or dare to send the first greeting? No one knew. Yet in the hush of the observatories, in the long nights spent waiting for a signal, one truth was undeniable. Curiosity had become humanity's strongest force. And perhaps it would be curiosity that decided whether Atlas marked the beginning of a great conversation or the opening notes of Earth's final requiem. The year 2030. The world stepped into a new decade beneath a different kind of sky. The nightmares of Atlas had not vanished, but they were no longer only shapeless terrors. Atlas had become a political and scientific emblem, a shared challenge that forced humanity to look straight at its collective responsibility. It reminded us that we are not merely scattered individuals, but a civilization standing before its greatest test. How will we act if the universe truly calls our name tomorrow? Inside national parliaments, once accustomed to endless disputes over narrow interests, the tone shifted. Politicians began to speak of responsibility before history, of the duty not to leave Earth's fate to the accidents of the cosmos. At the United Nations, a special body was created, the Global Committee on Cosmic Communication. For the first time, astrophysicists from SETI, aerospace engineers, philosophers, politicians, and even the military sat around the same table, wrestling with scenarios no precedent could guide. These meetings carried a double atmosphere, dread and hope. Dread, because any misstep might spell catastrophe for the entire planet. Hope, because for the first time in decades, humanity found a reason strong enough to unite beyond its divisions. Many experts admitted, never before in history had science, politics, and ethics been forced into such close alignment. Atlas, with its haunting silence, had become the catalyst pushing our species toward maturity. In its first session, the committee passed 3 landmark resolutions. First, to increase global funding for space research, especially for radio observation projects and planetary defense. Second, to construct a worldwide telescope network, linking data in real time so that no nation could monopolize information. Third, to establish the Atlas Data Bank, where all signal records and analyses would be publicly shared, giving every country and every institute equal access. This was a collective pledge. Science would no longer be private property, but the common foundation on which humanity would meet its trial. The public followed every development closely. They saw images once unimaginable, representatives of rival superpowers shaking hands in assembly halls, scientists from countries long opposed sitting side by side, exchanging data. On television screens, bold headlines ran, "Has Atlas forced humanity to unite?" For people who had grown accustomed to the helplessness of the previous 2 years, this was the first glimmer of light. Fear could be transformed into responsibility, responsibility into action, and action into hope. Atlas, once a symbol of dread, was slowly reshaped into a symbol of shared resolve. It was no longer just a drifting mass of ice and dust, but a moral and scientific examination placed before the whole species. And in the dawn of 2030, though fear still lingered, humanity began to learn how to answer that challenge, not with avoidance, but with unity. After the Global Committee on Cosmic Communication was established, a wave of unprecedented initiatives was set into motion. Within months, nations that had once eyed each other warily in high-tech fields agreed to share data and co-fund joint projects. In the United States, Russia, China, Europe, and Japan, massive radio observatories were linked into a planetary network of interplanetary listening posts, operating 24/7 so that no ripple from Atlas would escape analysis. At the same time, The long-term theoretical concept of planetary defense moved onto official agendas. NASA, ESA, and JAXA engineers began to draft scenarios. If Atlas, or any celestial body, ever posed a threat to Earth, humanity must have the technology to respond. Orbital tracking systems were upgraded, and once fantastical ideas, orbital lasers, nuclear propulsion craft, artificial magnetic shields, were now studied in earnest, backed by enormous budgets. One official declared, "Atlas has reminded us that any civilization that wishes to survive must learn to defend itself." But it was not all about weapons or hardened technology. A wave of constructive, humanistic collaborations also emerged. International universities opened new programs in cosmic communication studies, training a generation of scholars who could weave together astronomy, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and philosophy. Cross-continental conferences debated how to build a universal language to one day respond to Atlas, a language grounded in mathematics, musical ratios, and the immutable constants of physics. The idea sparked fascination and unease alike. If we answer, what words could speak for all of humanity? In society, shifts in collective spirit began to take root. Citizens across nations realized this was no longer just science fiction, but a generational survival issue. Millions signed petitions urging governments to invest more deeply in space research. Grassroots movements spread the slogan, "Atlas is the reminder Earth must be ready." In classrooms, students studied extraterrestrial communication scenarios as part of their science curriculum, no longer dismissed as fantasy but treated as practical education. And yet, the atmosphere remained weighted with unease. Everyone knew that every program, every budget, every plan was only a first step. We could prepare, but never fully control what might arrive from beyond. That fear itself became fuel, transforming anxiety into determination. As one scientist told the Global Assembly, "We did not choose the arrival of Atlas, but we can choose how we respond, and the only acceptable response is responsibility." Atlas, therefore, continued to embody paradox, sowing fear while also stirring hope, making humanity tremble while also compelling it to unite. The sweeping global initiatives became a clear declaration that we would no longer avert our gaze. Instead of waiting in helplessness, humanity chose to step forward, transforming fear into scientific and political commitment. By the end of 2030, the world would carry a very different atmosphere from 2 or 3 years before. When Atlas had first appeared, humanity had known only panic and endless arguments. Now, however, a fragile but undeniable spirit of global responsibility had begun to take shape. From parliaments to classrooms, from research councils to public squares, people were speaking about the same truth. We cannot leave the future to the silence of the cosmos. The United Nations passed a historic resolution, the creation of the Global Science and Space Security Alliance, GSSA, with an annual budget larger than any international body before it. The GSSA was given 2 core mandates. First, to develop planetary defense capabilities, including early detection and response to hazardous celestial bodies. Second, to prepare the legal and technical frameworks for potential contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. This was no longer dismissed as science fiction, but adopted as official policy, debated openly, and supervised by the global community. In press conferences, leaders did not hide their unease, but they emphasized collective resolve. One Secretary General declared, "Atlas has reminded us that Earth's fragility is not a sentence, but a summons to responsibility. We will not wait for miracles. We will prepare ourselves." His words resonated both as a warning and as a spark of belief. In the scientific community, new programs flourished. Supercomputers were enlisted to simulate thousands of possible contact scenarios, from the simplest signals to the most complex messages. Teams of linguists, artificial intelligence specialists, and philosophers collaborated to construct the first global language, a system of symbols grounded in mathematics, physics, and music, designed with the hope that any intelligence might understand. Though only a small step, many believed the effort itself planted the seeds of a new era, one where humanity would learn not only to speak with each other, but to attempt to speak with the cosmos. At the societal level, a fragile but genuine solidarity was forming. Ordinary people who once found terms like SETI or planetary defense distant and irrelevant now consider them part of their own story. Education programs integrated Atlas and the lesson of global responsibility into school curricula. Community movements adopted the slogan, "One planet, one responsibility." Though anxiety remained, humanity had begun to transform that anxiety into motivation, altering how people lived, thought, and perceived their place in the universe. As 2030 came to a close, humanity looked back on the 4 years since Atlas first appeared. From blind terror, to chaotic debate, to bitter disillusionment at last, we had entered a stage of anxious responsibility. Atlas still hung above us, silent, a question without an answer. Yet it was precisely that silence that forced humanity to grow up. And within the uncertainty, a new resolve emerged. Whether or not the universe ever answered, we would live as though our responsibility was clear to safeguard Earth, to protect life, and to prepare for the day the door to communication might finally open. Atlas, the cold traveler from the interstellar dark, had thus become not merely the ghost of fear, but the greatest ethical and scientific test ever faced. And for the first time, humanity had begun to write its answer not in words, but in action. The year 2031. 5 years had passed since Atlas first appeared, and then slowly faded from ordinary observation. Yet its shadow still hovered over humanity's consciousness, like an existential scar that could not be erased. Atlas remained nothing more than a drifting mass of ice and dust, silent, unresponsive, motionless. And yet, it was precisely that absolute silence that left behind an invisible legacy, one that transcended the boundaries of astronomy. It had become an existential mirror, a vast reflection suspended in the cosmos, casting back the most fundamental of questions. Who are we, truly, in this immensity? What do we wish to become before cosmic time finally closes its book? At first glance, Atlas's silence seemed like an absence. But when humanity grew patient enough to listen, they discovered it was a language of its own, a voiceless speech. The universe did not hand us ready-made answers, nor did it rush to soothe our restless longing. And within that endless delay, people began to understand. The greatest responsibility was not to wait for miracles from beyond, but to write their own story. Atlas, through its stillness, had become a mirror, forcing us to confront ourselves, to see clearly our fragility and helplessness, but also to recognize our yearning, our hope, and the quiet resilience burning deep within. If, in its earliest years, Atlas's presence had sown confusion, fear, and a collapse of trust, then by 2031, its silence was being received differently. No longer a suspended verdict, it had become fertile ground for spiritual growth. People learned to sit together, crossing the boundaries of nations, religions, and ideologies, to ask the shared questions. What does life truly mean? How do we take responsibility for this fragile blue planet? And what legacy can we leave behind in the universe? The existential anxiety, once viewed as a shadow, had transformed into fuel for imagination, for resolve, for a collective aspiration to build a shared future. Scientists admitted that Atlas had expanded the scope of inquiry, no longer just listening to the universe, but preparing to engage with it. Artists drew endless inspiration from its silence, composing music that echoed its repeating radio pulses, painting canvases that captured the deep crimson hush, creating films that placed humanity face to face with questions of responsibility and hope. Philosophers called Atlas an existential mirror, a presence that taught no specific knowledge, yet illuminated human limits, human longing, and human choice. In this deepened contemplation, humanity began to realize that they were not merely isolated individuals, but a fragile yet resilient civilization, learning to endure in the silence of the cosmos. Atlas, by doing nothing, by remaining silent, had delivered the most profound lesson. The meaning of existence is not found in receiving an answer, but in how we choose to respond in our unity, in our courage, and in our willingness to continue writing the shared story of humankind. From 2031 onward, the silence of Atlas was no longer viewed as a threatening void, but as a hidden reservoir of inspiration. In science, that silence ignited a wave of grand projects. New telescopes were built, not only to listen for signals but to learn the language of the cosmos, waves, frequencies, rhythms that might be the primitive letters of an alphabet vaster than any tongue humanity had ever spoken. Artificial intelligence laboratories developed algorithms to detect patterns in apparent chaos, driven by the conviction that behind every silence lies structure. That curiosity became a new scientific fuel, planting in the younger generation a belief that discovery is not about control, but about understanding, and about walking alongside the universe rather than trying to master it. In art, Atlas became an inexhaustible spring of creation. Composers transformed their static pulses into symphonies, calling them the music of silence. Painters filled enormous canvases with black and red symbols of the void and the dust storm while placing a faint green circle at the center, a sign of hope. Cinema entered a new golden age, with films placing their characters in imagined dialogues with Atlas. Some saw in it a friend, others an enemy, yet all carried the same message that in the silence of the cosmos, we are confronted with reflections of ourselves. In religion and philosophy, the silence of Atlas sparked unprecedented conversations. Philosophers called it the existential mirror of a new age. Instead of seeking answers out there, humanity was learning to turn inward. Some theologians regarded Atlas as proof that the universe carried a kind of will, a presence that challenged humanity to live more responsibly rather than chase the illusion of omnipotence. These discussions did not end in bitter disputes, but opened into hope that whether born of science or faith, all beliefs could converge on a single truth. Our existence has meaning only when we embrace collective responsibility. In daily life, Atlas became a symbol woven into every layer of culture. It was taught in schools, invoked in political speeches, and echoed in ordinary conversations. People no longer asked, "What is Atlas?" but rather, "What is Atlas reminding us of?" And the answer grew clearer with time. It reminded us to live more responsibly toward Earth, toward one another, and toward the future. Within that deepening contemplation, the silence of the cosmos ceased to drive humanity into despair. Instead, it stirred hope and creativity. Atlas, by saying nothing at all, compelled us to speak more with each other, to better understand both our fragility and our resilience. And from that silence, a new conviction slowly crystallized, that even though humanity is small, it can still choose to become a worthy storyteller in the epic of the universe. By the end of 2031, humanity stood at the threshold of a new decade, looking back on the journey since Atlas first appeared. In the early years, it sowed fear, unease, and despair. Then it became a paradox, an obsession, and eventually a symbol. And now, after 5 years, Atlas was no longer merely a celestial body. It had become the silent symphony of the cosmos, a symphony with no written melody, only a vague recurring rhythm, leaving humanity to compose its own notes. Philosophers called this the moment of existential maturity, the point at which a civilization understands that its value lies not in being handed answers, but in daring to pose its own questions and live with them. Atlas, through its absolute silence, accomplished what no religion, no philosophy, no ideology had ever done. It forced humanity to confront itself without avoidance, without illusion. And in that confrontation, a new belief began to take root, that we exist not merely to wait, but to create meaning. In the great cities of the world, statues and murals of Atlas rose as cultural emblems, but instead of carrying the weight of fear, they radiated hope. Inscriptions at the base of monuments read, "Live as if Atlas is watching." In classrooms, teachers reminded their students, Atlas does not answer, because the universe wants us to answer ourselves. In politics, leaders proclaimed, responsibility for Earth is the only way we can be worthy of the cosmos. These words were not empty slogans, but the distillation of an era. Humanity had endured an era both fragile and unforgiving. Young scientists said Atlas gave them a new drive, to pursue space research not as a conquest, but as a form of connection. Artists called Atlas the rest note in humanity's symphony, the long pause where all waited, so that humanity itself would have to write the next movement. And across every field, from science to culture, from education to politics, a shared idea resonated. The future is not a gift bestowed, but a story we choose to write. As 2031 drew to a close, people realized Atlas had never truly left. It remained not in the sky, but in the collective mind. It had become an existential mirror, a silent symphony, an invisible teacher. And from that presence arose a new responsibility. The responsibility to continue the story, to live with dignity, to pass on to future generations the conviction that even in infinite silence, we can still sing our own melody. In the end, Atlas was not a period. It was an ellipsis, an opening into the next chapter of civilization, a chapter of reflection, of hope, of responsibility. And in that chapter, Humanity, small though it may be, had begun to understand that the meaning of existence does not lie in what the universe says to us, but in how we choose to live and how we choose to craft our own reply.